Hi, and welcome to this week's episode of Art Like Everything Else, the podcast. So this week we're going to be talking about grief. So many people all over the world have experienced some form of grief. It is difficult. It is a difficult emotion that can sometimes feel like all-consuming, like that's all you can think about. And so as a result, there has come to be several beautiful works of art that do depict grief across time, across mediums, and across cultures. If you have any favorite works of art that discuss grief, drop them in the comments below. I'd love to learn more about them. But let's move on to the works of art that are going to be the topic for today's episode. So the first piece of art we will be discussing in this episode is Fleabag. So Fleabag is a television series from Britain. The show aired during the summer of 2016 to the spring of 2019. Something I learned while beginning my research for this episode actually is that the show was actually based on a one-woman show that was performed in 2013 by the same actress who plays the protagonist in the show. So the show is really good. At least I enjoyed it. I saw it recently because I kept seeing people reference it or post clips or gifs from the show. So I had kind of figured I should go ahead and check it out. This show follows our protagonist as she deals with varying levels of grief. So I'm going to detail a few of the things she's going through. However, I will do my best to avoid any major info that could be really spoilery. So where we begin in this show, our protagonist lost her mother some years prior and has relatively recently lost her best friend and business partner who she opened up a cafe with. And so she is struggling with her relationships with her family. Her guinea pig themed cafe isn't doing all that well, and the way she has been using to cope with it doesn't seem to be doing a good job of keeping her sane almost by the end of season 1. At the start of season 2, so Fleabag is on a journey in growing and changing despite her grief. She goes on the often suggested wellness journey of changing her diet, changing her lifestyle, but it is ultimately revealed that that alone wasn't enough. Our next piece of art is actually a video game. So the game is called Gris. It's a beautiful platform adventure game that was released in December of 2018. I got to play this game back in 2021. Fun fact, this was actually the first game I played entirely through on my Nintendo Switch. It's really beautiful. I'm definitely going to include some clips of the playthrough here. It's a lot of fun to play. It's a really beautiful game. The art style looks like a watercolor painting, and I thought that was really neat. The game follows our main character, Gris, on an adventure to regain the abilities she doesn't have in the beginning, that she kind of loses. So these, regaining of abilities is actually mirroring each of the stages of grief, so those stages being denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. So with each regained ability, there is more color added to the game. It's really beautiful. You can see it go from predominantly black and white to being full of color. And yeah, like I said, I'm going to be sure to try to include some clips. So yeah, it's really beautiful transition from the beginning to the very end. The environment regains life as well as as our character kind of regains these abilities, and the colors kind of regained throughout the game on your journey. And so something I really liked about the game was how I felt it did a really good job of what things could be after grief, with having to find yourself again. So grief is not easy to deal with, as can be seen in both of these works of art. Both of our subjects experience a level of grief that changes them in their entirety, and they both go on a journey to try to feel more like themselves again. To overcome the grief that they are feeling, now I really want you to check out Fleabag if you haven't already, because her journey can be seen more so in the filming and the ways she communicates with those watching the show, and also the people in the in the show, of course, too. So it's hard to detail her experience without potential spoilers. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to include a link to a video I watched that kind of also talked about the filming. And I'll put that in the show notes. And then you can go and watch it and check it out on your own time. It is on Amazon Prime. There's only 12 episodes and they're all like 21 to 24 minutes. Like I accidentally finished this entire show in one night. Like I didn't know it was that short. That's how quick it is. But there is a way that Fleabag, our protagonist in the show, she uses her breaking of the fourth wall and engaging the audience as a way to cope with her grief in a way. And then there's also the camera work in the show that I believe with telling the story kind of shows how like disjointed she is in the interaction she has. So it's fascinating that by the end of the show, it is obvious that she has indeed changed and has grown in a way that she feels comfortable moving forward with her life, because there's this transition and this shift in the way it's filmed, the way she engages with the audience. So this isn't also unlike Gris, who is going on this adventure to literally find pieces of herself again. So in the beginning of the game, she is seen on a statue who I believe represents the person she lost. And she's experiencing, like she's unable to sing, like she tries to sing, but like nothing is really coming, and the statue kind of crumbles. And then at the end of her journey, after she's refound herself, after she has gone through those changes of grief, she returns to the broken statue and she sings, and the statue reforms, and it's a really beautiful scene. But you do still see the cracks in the statue, but it is now filled with color. It like unlike how it was before. I thought that visual was really cool. It kind of reminded me of the Japanese art of kintsugi, which is a way of repairing like broken pottery by mending the broken parts with a urushi lacquer, which is like the sap from a Japanese tree. And then it sometimes mixed with gold, silver, or like platinum dust. So it's like showing this like that the cracks in this is still really beautiful, and it has a history, and like showing that like it is beautiful despite that history, and like not being the same as it was before. Which is how I personally think a lot of things tend to be after grief. So often when we experience grief, we want to go back to being the person we were before, like the person we were before the grief happened. We want to be the version of ourselves that never experienced this grief. But in reality, that is just not possible. Like we are not that person anymore. We can't hide those scars. We have experienced the crack in ourselves, and we simply must fill it with lacquer and gold and move on. I took a class on the psychology of grief when I was in undergrad, and in that class I learned a lot. One of the things I learned is that you can grieve many things. At the time of the class, I hadn't experienced a loss in the way of the death of someone or something close to me. And so in some conversations, I felt very out of place when I was in the class. But it was in this class that I learned that loss of experiences, loss of stability, a loss of safety, those can all also be reasons to grieve. And those reasons of grieving can stay with you. Now, there is a Tonkin's model of grief, which is a grief model that looks at grief and recovery differently than a lot of other models and theories. So this model in particular started in like 1996, I believe. It talks about growing around grief. So it doesn't say that your grief gets smaller or that it goes away. It kind of emphasizes that you simply grow a life around that grief. And this is something that I felt personally. Like, I don't think grief ever really goes away. I do think it stays with you. And we very often, we learn to live with it, and we build a life outside and around it. So like on some days, it is easier to live with that grief than others. But very often we live with it and we keep going. So this is something I think that happened with the characters in the art we discussed earlier. Their grief never really went away. They simply learned how to live with it. Something I thought was really neat when it came to this particular, like how this shows up for our characters, is actually in how, with Fleabag, our main protagonist, how the shift in the way she engages the people, she kind of decides to build a life outside of like the grief and like the ways that she's been coping, and she finds a way to cope that makes living with that grief easier. And kind of on the same lines as Gris, the game, in which our character is seen going with like and getting everything back. Like, she doesn't forget this grief. She simply like refines herself and learns to live with that grief. And so, yeah, feeling consumed by grief and feeling like you're having to find a way to exist again with your grief is not new. Like I said, the Tompkins model of grief came out in 1996. And so this feeling also isn't something you're alone in feeling, as evidenced by the characters and the art we discussed in this episode, and the acclaim, and like I've seen a lot of people talk about how much they enjoy the show Fleabag. I've seen a lot of people talk about how much they enjoy the game Gris. Like, you're not alone in feeling like this, especially considering the art we discussed in this episode. So maybe even in feeling that all-consuming grief and needing to find yourself again, maybe that too can be an art like everything else. For this week's Art That Made Me Think, the art that made me think this week is an excerpt from a book called Thoughts Without a Thinker, Psychotherapy from a Buddhist Perspective by Mark Epstein. And so the excerpt reads, let me look at my computer. So the excerpt reads, I'll put it here on the screen as well. It's called The Glass Is Already Broken. You see this goblet, asks Ajahn Chah, the Thai meditation master. For me, this glass is already broken. I enjoy it. I drink out of it. It holds my water admirably, sometimes even reflecting the sun in beautiful patterns. If I should tap it, it has a lovely ring to it. But when I put this glass on the shelf and the wind knocks it over, or my elbow brushes it off the table and it falls to the ground and shatters, I say, of course. When I understand that the glass is already broken, every moment with it is precious. I thought this excerpt was really beautiful. I found it while I was scrolling Twitter, and I thought it could actually, in a way, be kind of tied to what we were talking about earlier. So like earlier in this episode, when it comes to grief and having to refine yourself. So oftentimes, I feel a lot of people are afraid of potential grief when it comes to starting potential ventures. So like getting into specific relationships, or even like trying out new things we dreamed our entire lives of doing. Like, what if we approached what was in front of us instead of anticipating the end? What if we just kind of enjoy the new experience, that new relationship, instead of like avoiding them because you are afraid of potential hurt? Like, how much more enjoyable could our lives be if we understood how precious all the present moments could be? Anyway, that's all I have for you today. Like, comment, subscribe, follow. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being. Have a good rest of your day. Bye.